Hola, buenos dias. My name is Alison Castel, and I'm an assistant professor of rhetoric and communication studies at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. First of all, I want to thank Mediación for having me here to share my perspectives on narrative and communication in the context of COVID-19. My specialization is in narrative and conflict and its resolution, and I see a lot of translation here between my work and what can offer an analysis of the pandemic. For the purposes of this analysis, I'm going to be using the United States as my case study, and I'm going to be drawing on a framework that I collaboratively developed for a textbook entitled Intro to Conflict Resolution, Dynamics and Discourses and Dynamics. So, narrative is really important to understand and for many reasons. It's uniquely human, and narratives provide the architecture for how we make sense of the world, for how we create meaning in the world. Stories that we tell actually pave the way for our understanding of what becomes possible in our actions and behaviors as well. This has serious consequences when you start thinking about life and death situations such as the pandemic and COVID-19. Not all narratives are created equal, and some stories are better than others. And this is a very messy landscape that we're trying to understand, but we do know that there's certain characteristics of narratives. Some are polarizing, some are bridging, some are dominant, some are silenced, and it's really important to just get a sense of what all that means. So for the purposes of this talk, and this is a very short video, I'm going to be identifying three main narrative strands or archetypes: the battle narrative, the coexistence narrative, and the solidarity narrative. And while I'm going to be giving some illuminations of each one, it's by no means comprehensive, and it's just meant to be a framework for analyzing the context. The first narrative strand that I want to discuss with you is the battle narrative. The battle narrative, as you can see, is embedded deeply into the discourses around COVID-19. And they're not just happening at the national level or with the leadership, they're also grounded locally in localized discourses as well, but they're definitely propagated at the national level. There's some attributes of a battle narrative that I'll be going through that I want to highlight. One is that they're generally, that they identify a common enemy. That's really important. The second thing is that they are binary in their constructions of the characters. So characters have very thin value systems like good versus evil or right versus wrong, and the characters themselves are very unidimensional. And the third thing is that they're largely grounded in fear. There's a legacy, though, of the battle narrative in the United States that makes it a very comfortable narrative. People are very accustomed to hearing it, and it also makes it easier for justifying certain kinds of actions. In the righteousness and the certainty, people can settle in. So in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, the responses that come out of this battle narrative are very recognizable. The economic lockdown would be one example. The repurposing of companies to produce products that might be helpful on the front lines of the pandemic. And also the way that hospitals have restructured to both in their allocation of resources, how the physical space has been allocated, and also how personnel has been reallocated as well. This is very representative of a crisis response to an immediate threat, and it's meant to reduce chaos and control the spread of the virus, which are all things that we actually want. But there's also limitations to this because it's predicated on the idea that we can actually predict and control what's happening with the virus. And the virus is not predictable. And not only are we unable to track its pathway of its own volition, but it's actually subject to human behavior. And human behavior is definitely not predictable. So the other thing is that it doesn't acknowledge the uncertainty that's involved in this context. That we don't even know if we're going to find a vaccine. This battle narrative is very predicated on the notion of eradication, on annihilation of an enemy, and with that uncertainty not being acknowledged, then we only have a limited set of purposes, and it reduces our possibility for planning, foresight, and setting contingencies. There's another reason why the battle narrative is extremely problematic, and we've seen this in kind of secondary narrative responses or offshoots that are happening, where this binary and this us versus them are actually creating and generating multiple enemies. And so we've seen the enemy emerge as, for example, China, people of Asian descent, so-called socialists, the United States government, the World Health Organization, all of these creating an enemy that requires us to reduce them, to dehumanize them, to alienate them, which is a very polarizing act, and actually creates more xenophobia and racism in our country. And actually we've seen this even exacerbated because of the way in which the debates about how to act and who to believe, as far as pitting Democrats versus Republicans, scientists versus politicians, and even our responses, which is something to the effect of an economic death or a death by the virus. All of these are very rigid, black and white constructions of what's possible. There's no room within these debates for constructive dialogue. Options are life and death. And we actually we're pitted against each other instead of working toward the common problem. This also heightens a sense of insecurity, which is very common within the context of a battle narrative. And when you're acting from a place of fear and insecurity, it actually diminishes how creative we can be in our responses. We have limited faculties. For example, if we're extremely scared, the physiology of our body might send us into like a fight or flight or freeze mode, which wouldn't be constructive. And it also reduces our ability to unify. Because these kinds of weak narratives, these are weak constructions, lead to individual, and fear responses also lead to individualist responses to like self-preservation, self-interest, and we can actually see that in activities or actions that happen where people are hoarding groceries or hoarding toilet paper, just for example. And this privileging of the individual over the group makes it very difficult to think about the common good. And we also see this in these small protests that happen but gain a lot of attention, where people were claiming that their civil liberties were being infringed upon because of the shelter-in-place orders by the government. And this is really problematic because it fails to acknowledge our interdependence as human beings, especially in this time of crisis. And it favors that individuals who can actually afford to take risks because of whatever resources they have that other people don't have. So in this context, we've now understood how we've been foreclosing dialogue, we've been focused on the individual, we've lost some of the sense of the common good, and we've lacked a level of analysis which would take into consideration the context in which the virus is living, and even further, any kind of systemic or structural inequality that's been revealed over time. And so while this is the case, I want to now move on to the understanding that there are other narratives that have emerged, and these narratives that I'm calling coexistence narratives have done some work to challenge this battle narrative context. So coexistence narratives enter into the landscape and really shift what is going on within the battle narrative. They position civil society actors as critical to understanding the way in which we're experiencing the virus. This alternative discourse makes new kinds of language possible, like the language of cooperation and kindness and shared humanity, which is really particular to the coexistence narrative. It came to be said that no American is immune to the virus, and based on that, a kind of responsibility for other started to emerge as a result of this discourse. And we saw this manifesting in many different ways when we started to help each other and come together, even in the way that we started to appreciate, for example, some of the essential workers. We could see people clapping for each other. In my neighborhood, we howl like wolves at 8 o'clock at night every night. You see neighbors offering to buy groceries for those who are elderly and were unable to get their needs met. And we also see things like boxes of free essentials being offered on street corners and in front of houses for people to take essential goods. In this context, with the new forms of speaking, it moves away, as you can see, from the us versus them mentality and from self-interest and self-preservation into a more understanding of unity and even sameness for this virus affecting us all. And in these new conditions, new stories can emerge, and the stories that we begin to hear are about people's actual lived experiences. If they've been affected by the virus, what was their experience of that? Really more touch with the context of what's going on the ground. And even in this space, new local medical information began to circulate, giving civil society members an opportunity to get different kinds of information and make their own discernment about what the experts are saying. This also began to challenge what was newsworthy and moved really away from the government instantiated polarizing or politicized narratives to the valor of people as actors in their everyday experience. Flattening the curve became very prominent during this time, where people felt a sense of responsibility not only to ourselves but to stay at home so that we could stop the spread of the virus and keep the risk of infection low. And not only does this narrative represent a form of cooperation, but I would also offer that as a form of resistance against the polarizing narratives. In this context, also, we saw a surgence of good news that was heralded as a way to shine a light on things that were going on that weren't only negative. And we saw in these snippets of good news the way in which humans adapt and their ingenuity. So, for example, celebrating milestones like graduations and birthdays with parades and cars was something that we saw in a lot of ways. There's also a propensity to reflect on this movement as having some possible positive notes to it, generating some hope in the midst of it all. And so this narrative has really helped build a context where we actually understand what's going on a little bit more on the ground, and yet it also still needs a little bit more complexity added to it, because it doesn't actually acknowledge a lot of the systemic issues that have been revealed since the start of the pandemic. And so that's why we're going to move to solidarity narratives next to talk about that. All right, so we had the coexistence narrative, which created a new pathway for casting civil society as critical actors in this pandemic. And yet we still need to push a little bit further, because we have not acknowledged beyond our shared humanity that there's been differential vulnerability to the violence, that there is inequality in the way that this virus affects people. And so we need another layer of analysis. So now we can get more deeper into issues of power and justice, and understand that as we move away from black and white analyses, that we're navigating uncertainty and that we need different kinds of levels of adaptation. So in the US, it's been revealed this level of inequality that existed before the pandemic, but has come into such sharper focus during this time that it's really difficult to look away. If you look at the statistics, people who have been affected very disproportionately by the virus are people of color, people of low socioeconomic status, and women. It's created an increased vulnerability, and also this recognition that our low-wage essential workers, so people who are working at grocery stores, who have been the backbone of our stability during this time, are not valued to the extent that they should be. And to compound that, we have millions and millions of people who have lost their jobs, creating an even more deeper sense of vulnerability than we had before the virus. So as we move from battle narrative to coexistence narrative, now to solidarity narrative, we're now moving into a politics of what can be said, what's not said, what's silenced, what's actually spoken, and making visible the increased differential of who's affected and how by this virus. And so this actually paves the way for a different kind of public discourse around the virus, that we can actually look at the common good as the focus and consider ethical policymaking and what is ethical human behavior and determining, as I said, what's best for the majority and the common good. One narrative that has been really helpful in this and increased traction is a public health narrative, because it really foregrounds interdependence and how viruses move among people, and it moves away from the battle narrative and actually complexifies the coexistence narrative by addressing power and structural inequalities. So it's not just about protecting ourselves, but it's about protecting the most vulnerable. And not just for the short term, and that's, we're talking about looking at systemic change which happens over the long term. In our country, it's been said that we are only as healthy or well as our least insured person. So even that analysis directly relates to a systemic understanding of what's happening. So we have this new language that's emerged in the context of COVID, of sheltering in place, flattening the curve. That's all part of this discourse as well. We also have now the debates about wearing masks, but as they're debates whether or not we should be wearing them, oftentimes that's going back into our battle discourse. The solidarity narrative pushes us to think in more decentered ways. So how do we act in ways that decenters ourselves, and even if it means inconveniencing ourselves? In this kind of ethics of care, we're recognizing that people aren't responsible for creating the circumstances that they're in, and therefore we need responses that hold accountable not only ourselves but the institutions to responding to these. Some ways that people have been acting in solidarity, for example, would be people who remain employed during this time, taking and organizing around taking their stimulus checks and donating that to organizations who are working with the most vulnerable populations. There's also been a proliferation of mutual aid organizations that have gained notoriety for helping out people who aren't necessarily benefiting from the system. There's also a response to racism bot on Twitter that is automatically giving counter narratives to racist content that's on Twitter. And all of these examples are recognizing that there's inherent in our system of power that there's an intricate interconnection between those who benefit from the system and those who are exploited by it or don't benefit from it. So some of the ways in which privilege has been marked in different kinds of ways during the pandemic that might not have been visible before, for example, are people who are able to have their groceries delivered to them, or people who are actually able to physically or socially distance because of the spaces where they live. And also people who have parents who can stay home and work from home or not work to take care of children. But I don't want to slip back into individualist concepts or individualist understandings of this problem because the solidarity view asks us to really take into consideration the relationship between what's happening on the ground and what's happening at the state level, and to think about how those can be interrelated for a better approach to looking at the conflict, the context. When we start to acknowledge this interdependence and our narratives start to reflect that, then our narratives advance, and they have different kinds of characteristics, like our characters can be multidimensional instead of unidimensional. They have complex value systems that transcend just good versus evil or right versus wrong, or this debate stage that we've created. We recognize that the problem needs a holistic analysis, and that it needs to be in conversation, not only with government, but in coordination with civil society and grassroots understanding of the problem. So this kind of narrative space and action space might be aspirational, but the only way that we're going to actually be able to work toward that is if we stop telling bad stories. So we need to stop telling stories that are laden with blame and accusation and that position people as a problem. And once we do that, stop doing that, we start looking at the problem itself as the problem instead of getting derailed by these other kinds of characterizations. And then we create solutions that are people-centered and that don't allow some to profit off of a context like this and others to become more vulnerable. So each one of these narratives has a place and a function, within the context of COVID, and I've outline this framework to see what happens when you scaffold from a more simple narrative to a more complex narrative, moving from battle to coexistence to solidarity. And my hope is that if we can make it to a place where a solidarity narrative becomes our space of action, that we can actually do what some are calling is build back better, which is not return back to the status quo, and to actually reshape our institutions to be more responsive to people's experiences.